what I'd like to do is to break you up into 85 word shot groups. 3 each. Elect a secretary and solve all the problems of the faith. But I won't do that to you, because I know that's just a cheap way out of not giving a talk. I just got through doing kind of what I'm going to do to you in motion 5 days. I'm going to do to you in 2 40-minute sessions. But it'll be very abbreviated. I say do to you. I hope it will actually be something we will do together. The titles that have been thrust upon me by the committee, I will choose to ignore for the moment. They have great thematic significance, as you will see. I hope you'll see. I don't know that I will, but you will. And that's part of the assignment you have for the session I will do tomorrow, to find out how the topics that they have put on the program relate to what I'm going to say. I'll ask you that question after I'm through, and maybe we'll have an answer. The topic that I'm going to use as a temporary one in its place is the poetry of the Baha'i life. In 2 parts. The part this morning, how it works, how the poetic process works in the Baha'i life, or relates to the Baha'i life. And then tomorrow we will deal with how to make your life a poem. I'm going to start off, I'm actually going to put something on that in just a minute. I'm going to start off by reading a poem, appropriately enough. The poem is called Peter Quince at the Clavier. I'm just going to read a few stanzas of it for a very specific purpose. It's a poem by Wallace Stevens, written in 1923. Just as my fingers on these keys make music, so the self-same sounds on my spirit make a music too. Music is feeling then, not sound. And thus it is that what I feel here in this room, desiring you, thinking of your blue shadowed silk, is music. Now, the setting here is, if you'll allow me to be an English professor for a few seconds, the setting here is that Peter Quince is sitting at a clavier, a harpsichord, and he's looking at what we presume is a beautiful woman in blue shadowed silk, and the image of that woman plays upon his spirit, and he's saying, now I'm going to sit at this musical instrument and play the music that I hear. And when I do, that same music I am playing will come back and inspire me in another way. Now the poem goes on very elaborately, and I'm not going to give you an analysis of the poem. That would take a couple of days with this particular poem. But let me show you what I think is being set up here by Stevens. Can anyone see this, or is the glare fun? Is it okay? You can't see it. How about if I turn it? No, don't do that. Don't worry about it. Well, pretend you can see it. Just follow my hand, all right? Because I'm just going to draw some arrows. We have the woman in the room, which plays upon the imagination of Peter Quince. Now, Peter Quince is a character in a Shakespearean play who directs the play within the play in Midsummer Night's Dream. So he's kind of inept. He's not a very good, he's not a very artistic person. But nevertheless, as best this inartistic person can, he's going to use his imagination to do what? To give a sensible form to this abstract feeling and produce music. But interestingly enough, the chain of causality doesn't stop there. That music goes on to re-affect his imagination, as well as that, presumably, of the woman whom he's trying to seduce, and it will go on. That is the poetic process, in one image of the poetic process. To give concrete form, in this case, audible music, to abstract thought or feeling. In fact, one definition by Orton of what a poem is thought that is felt. You could generalize to say that the whole function of any art is to give form to the spirit. And it's not something you can do directly. I would say the most arduous hours an artist spends is trying to come up with what T.S. Eliot calls the objective correlative for feeling. That thing, if it's a plastic art, or that method of operation, if you're a performing artist, that will concretize the emotion you're trying to convey or explain. It's a very important process. And one of the things we're going to do for a few minutes later is to explain why it's so important, what the value of it is. Let me give you another poem, a stanza from a poem. This is by Yeats. This is called Sailing to Byzantium. An aged man is but a paltry thing, a tattered coat upon a stick, unless soul clap its hands and sing and louder sing for every tatter in its mortal dress. Now that's a very fine image, a visual image. An aged man is but a paltry thing, a tattered coat upon a stick. If you know someone who is old, or you yourself are old, and you look in the mirror, you know that the physical aspect of an aged person is nothing. It is dust. I could probably beat up most aged people in this room. That doesn't mean I am superior to them in any significant way, however. If that aged person has, as Yeats said, allowed his soul to clap its hands and sing. When I read that poem to my students and study that poem, I always think of several conventions ago when Hannah Bacall, a lawyer, was speaking on the stage at the McCormick Inn. And he had to be helped up the steps, and I've never seen a man who was breathing and alive who looked more frail. And yet, as he sat in that chair and spoke, the veils of age were peeled away, word by word, until you saw being conveyed through that frail body a spirit that could conquer the world. And I always think of this image, that indeed his soul was clapping its hands very loudly and very profoundly. Now, how is all this related to our purpose as Baha'i, this poetic process? What has Yeats done with that image? He has given you a single metaphor that captures in your mind a thought. He could have done it directly. He could have simply said, I think it's very important that as you get older, you should approach matters of the intellect and the spirit. And louder sing for every tatter in its mortal dress. Tatters in your dress, your body, scars learn something from this life so that by the time you get old, you are very wise and so on. He could have said this directly. Why didn't he? Why did the poets resort to metaphor? Why did the prophets resort to metaphor? Because as we know, one of the values of studying this poetic process is to be able to decipher the writings of the prophets, because that is a process that they often use. That's one of the obvious values of it. But I'm going to relate it more directly to our purpose as Baha'i. What is our purpose as Baha'i? To know and worship God. We say it every day in the noonday prayer. To know and to worship God. But we're also told in the writings that God is unknowable. So we can't do it. So obviously by knowing God, we do not mean to know the essence of God, because it doesn't say God is unknowable. It says God is essentially unknowable. The essence of God is unknowable. But God is very knowable through his attributes and through the prophets, who are the metaphorical representatives of God on this planet. They are, if you will, God's attributes translated into a poetic form. Now, to know and to worship. Obviously, knowledge in this sense is distinct from the knowledge that we commonly associate with human learning. In fact, Baha'u'llah tells us that, in case we don't know it. He says the knowledge he's talking about uses two terms in two different places. Indeed, God, he says, it is not the learning common amongst men. And in another place, he says, it is not acquired learning that enables us to know the attributes of God and to understand the teachings of manifestation. And that's only appropriate, isn't it? Since we are told that everyone, regardless of their education or rank, has the capacity to recognize the manifestation. Therefore, everyone has that responsibility. And secondly, we are told, perhaps even more importantly, that no one spiritual state of being can be conditioned by another. Powerful idea, because it means, in effect, no one can make you spiritual. No one can do it for you. People can help you. People can make it easier for you, but they can't make your choices for you. Therefore, it's only appropriate that everyone must have access to the knowledge of God. So we're not talking about acquired learning. Scholarship here has nothing to do with the kind of learning we're talking about. We're talking about recognizing attributes of God. And worship. We worship God. But of course here we obviously know that that means more than simply praying prayers. Why do we know that? What else is worship? Work. That's the first thing we think of, because that's the thing we have to try to figure out most often, is how in the world what we do every day relates to our lives as Baha'i. Because so often it doesn't. And we have to figure a way to sanctify it, to make it a metaphorical expression of worship. Because that's what it is, if it's done in the right spirit. To worship, then, does not simply mean to pray. It means anything we do which in some way exalts God through our lives. Now, that's not all of our purpose. That's not the complete statement of it. It is true, but it is not sufficient. In the Aghdad, Baha'u'llah adds another quality to this law, to this commandment, to this statement of Baha'i purpose, which is what? else dealing more directly with these two things. And what becomes, in effect, the preamble to the Agos Baha'i says two things are incumbent upon every individual. Number one, to recognize the manifestation. Number two, that he says immerse yourself in writing, but that's not what follows it. Obedience. Obedience to the ordinances of the manifestation. Now see the parallelism here? To know the manifestation, to recognize the manifestation. We just said we can't know God except through the manifestation. Through the attributes of God, and the attributes are revealed through the manifestation. We're told in writing, without the manifestation, not only no knowledge of God is possible, hence Christ said, no man cometh unto the Father but by me. And Abdul Baha says, if the manifestations didn't come, the earth would be desolate. We know the properties of God, the attributes of God through the manifestations, and therefore in the Agos, the recognition he's talking about is the same thing as the knowledge of God. So he's talking in effect about the same commandment, the same statement of purpose. Two things in common. Recognize the manifestation, and secondly, obey. Do what they say. Same thing. In other words, to put it simply, first we come to know, and then we do. Which is exactly what Abdul Baha says when he says, by faith is meant first to know, then to do. That's the Baha'i definition, or one of the Baha'i definitions of faith. There are others. But it's an important distinction in the concept of faith from what you have in other religions, where faith is deemed a leap of belief. You must accept the sacrifice that Christ made. You must believe. Baha'is do not say that. Their writings do not say that. In fact, they say not only must you not believe, you cannot believe unless independently you confirm for yourself the validity of the claims of Baha'u'llah. And the more ways you confirm it, the more confirmed you are and the more certitude you obtain. To know, then to do. But there's another part in that same passage in the Agos. It doesn't just say that you must do these two things. It says another crucial aspect of it, which is what? Neither is acceptable without the other. And this, too, is an terribly important distinction between the Baha'i concept of belief and that of almost every other religion, certainly the major Protestant religions. Namely, that belief is not only signaled by deeds, it is dependent on deeds and inextricably linked to deeds. In effect, it is not sufficient to say you recognize Baha'u'llah unless you do something about it. And that means more than simply signing a card. It means you put that belief in motion. So, in other words, it is not only linked, these aren't coordinate. In other words, we do this, and by the way, we also do this. No, these things are inextricably linked together. Now, how does this relate to the poetic process? Well, probably many of you already see how it does, but let me give it some clarification. As I try to show up here, the first thing that Peter Quint does is receive some perception of beauty. But notice, it's not beauty in some abstract, ethereal form. It is beauty made concrete in some way he can understand. Because, as educationists know, A person can't learn an abstraction without a concrete reference. You cannot simply teach a child goodness or truth or beauty or justice or anything of spiritual attributes without giving them an experience they can relate it to. Just can't do it. The human being at this point is incapable of understanding it directly. So Peter Quint sees this manifestation of beauty, this attribute of beauty as it's represented in this woman. It affects him. And he translates it not into the same thing. He doesn't go put on a blue silk gown himself. He creates music. Essentially different endeavors, and yet with a common thread. That is metaphor. That is the definition of what metaphor is. Essentially different things sharing some common quality. And that is a uniquely human capacity to extract from different experiences a similar quality. That's what we're doing here. We perceive an attribute of God as concretized in the poetic statements of the manifestation, in the metaphorical, symbolical, and therefore poetic actions of the manifestation, and indeed of those Baha'is around us. And we turn around and do the same thing, make a poetic statement by acting out our understanding in some way that may be the same or it may be quite different. It may be something where instead of doing the same thing we see done, we do something of a similar nature or something that has the same quality to it. So, for example, a child learns about love in a uniquely human way by synthesizing and compiling in its brain, unconsciously for the most part, brand new shoes, ingredients, examples of love. Love is a hug. You see that on bumper stickers, so we'll start there. At the very basic level, bumper sticker theology. Now, the child is experiencing other things too, which it may not associate with love, such as punishment. It is restricted or chastised. But at some point, it synthesizes this experience with the punishment to recognize, and it may be much later in its life when it finally has children of its own, that these two things are both expressions of the same attribute. It starts, in other words, seeing the metaphorical or poetic relationship between these essentially different experiences. Furthermore, it doesn't just repeat those as it grows up, nor does it stay at the level of parental love. As it grows up, we presume it discovers love in creation, pets, animals, beauty of nature, friends. Mankind, eventually, if it is taught well, And finally, creation as a whole, and that is the plan of God. Because when you think about it, and we'll get to this more later, the whole world, as described by Abdu'l-Baha, is but a shadowy reflection of the kingdom. That is its purpose, to reflect the kingdom. That is its only
capacity that is important. Its capacity to reflect the attributes of God. In other words, the whole created world, this planet, and the rest of creation as well, is but a poetic statement, a metaphorized statement of the divine world. And that's why scientists seem to be forever these days discovering moral truth in scientific law, because it was always there, reflecting the moral law, the spiritual law. So what is ecology? Ecology is the sudden discovery that all the creation is one. We'll get to that later too. But here's another aspect then. To know, to worship, inextricably related, causally related. First you know, then you do. But here's another quality to it, a fourth quality. It is progressive. And that is, it doesn't simply become cyclical, where you know, then you do, and then you remember what you knew. You know, and you do, and the doing itself brings about greater knowledge. And therefore, properly understood and applied, the poetic process in the Baha'i life involves an ever-expanding application of knowledge, an ever-expanding translation of spiritual understanding into physical form. Now you get the sense of what I'm talking about. Namely, that our lives as Baha'is are the process of creating our own poetry, our own poems. Hence, work done as worship means work which applies this understanding in some metaphorical way. Well, that's all very neat, but so what? You're saying to yourselves. You may not be saying, you may be saying, gee, that's wonderful, or you may be saying, I read that in this book. That is the crucial question. So what? And I'll explain why. Really, the essence of what I've said here, you can find in every passage, just about in the writings. You know, in Gleanings, Baha'u'llah says, everything in creation has the capacity to reflect the attributes of God, and in fact, without that capacity, it would cease to exist. You can find this stated all over the place. This isn't my idea, after all. In fact, I don't think I have any original ideas, except what I gleaned from the writings, which doesn't bother me in the least, because that's the only thing that I care to learn about. It's the only thing that makes sense of the world to me. And that's the joy of this faith to me as a man who pretends to educate people, that with the writings we can dare to ask whatever we wish, and if we persist in the proper spirit, our questions will be answered. That is both an expression of certitude and a confirmation of it. Think about that. We'll get back to that tomorrow too, but let's go to the next step. Why does it have to be this way? What value is it? Why could God not have done it better? On some level, if we haven't thought about this, we have to say to ourselves, God must be at least as intelligent as I am. And if I can see what's wrong with the world, I bet he does too. If he wants us to be spiritual, why aren't we? As much as I abhor some of the things that the comedian Carlin says, one thing that's kind of funny, and that is, I'm not sure God is all-powerful because everything he makes dies. Well, on some level, we say the same thing. If his purpose is to educate us, why aren't we educated? purpose is to reveal these attributes to us. Why does he beat around the bush? Why this indirection? Why is he the concealer? Because that's one of the attributes of God, the concealer. Now, on the one hand, the answer is somewhat simple. If you are in education or have been educated, when you think about it, a teacher withholds information from the student on purpose for a benign reason. If I'm teaching you math, it would do you little good if I said, here are the problems and here are all the answers, and memorize it. Well, you laugh, but I mean, that is virtually a definition of most of the education that abounds right now. There's a whole process that has arisen in the last few years called academic hothousing, where you take innocent little children and you program them to do just such things as that. And they're only now discovering the detrimental results of that, namely that it burns them out, and in later years they will rebel against education, and very soon in their process of education they will be behind those who were not so afflicted. The definition of education for the Baha'i, or for anyone, is acquiring tools for advancement, not to be brainwashed or programmed or catechized. No one can demand that you have faith in Baha'u'llah, or they can demand it, but it will do no good. Or if you accept it, then you have nothing of worth. The teacher withholds answers because the teacher wants you to see how the process works. Because what the teacher really wants you to acquire is not the answer to a specific problem, but the ability to go out and resolve all kinds of other problems, maybe quite different problems. So that by studying nuclear physics, you may see the relationship between the nuclear structure and the structure of the universe, and ultimately see how all things fit together, the unity in diverse items of creation. But there's some other very specific things that are gained by this process that I wish to share with you, other than simply this general observation that tests are valuable. What I mean by that is simply that when the teacher gives you a test, if it's an intelligent test, you are not simply throwing back at the teacher something you've memorized, you are exercising the tool, and the teacher's trying to see if you've acquired the tool. If the teacher's doing something else other than that, then the teacher is not a very good teacher. Likewise, if in our spiritual lives we simply react, if we're indoctrinated rather than educated, we act mechanically out of imitation rather than following the definition of human justice as stated by Baha'u'llah in the second hidden word, to see with your own eyes and to hear with your own ears. There's a kind of autonomy. Since no man's spiritual development is conditioned by another. There has to be. It doesn't mean you're isolated and alone by any means, but it means that on some level you have to do this, initiate this process on your own. So what is the value then of this indirection? Well, the indirection, as I said, requires that we work on our own rather than simply memorize this is love, this is not love, so on. We have to acquire tools. But think again about the poetic process. An aged man is but a paltry thing, a tattered coat upon a stick, and a soul clap its hands and sing, and louder sing for every tatter in its mortal dress. Love that line. What has the poet done? First of all, the poet has compressed a lot of information into a very small experience. If you explicate a point for pages to explain what one image is doing. Just as if you try to explicate one of Christ's parables, you will require paragraphs and paragraphs and paragraphs before you can understand how the parable of the vineyard represents the kingdom of God. Terribly difficult thing to do. It compresses. Secondly, it is memorable. It is memorable. If you tell a child, be good, that's not memorable. It's not even understandable. The child, as do we, needs specific metaphorical statements of that abstraction. Thirdly, the spiritual quality is translated into personal experience, which is very important because it means, in effect, that you are able to relate to the things you don't know about the things you do know. Let me give you an example from the child's poem. Twinkle, twinkle, little star, how I wonder what you are, up above the world so high like a diamond in the sky. Beautiful little poem, because in a very few lines it captures the whole feeling of a child's perspective on the universe. What is that thing up there? And the thing it can relate it to is something that it's seen that also has kind of a wonder to it, the sparkling diamond. It learns to describe and understand the thing it doesn't know in terms of things it does know. Just as we learn to understand God, which we can never know, in terms of the manifestation whom we can kind of know. It requires individual initiative, the poetic process. When Christ responded in parables, his disciples asked, "Why do you speak in parables?" In effect, these poor learned Jews come to you and ask you these very direct questions, and you answer them with a story. Why do you do that? And of course, Baha'i says somewhat the same thing in the Iran, where he says, "Behold how God does stir up the masses, to stir up the people." He says it's almost, you feel with a sense of humor, like, isn't that neat how God does that? And Christ's response is, because to you it has been given to know, but to them, seeing they do not see and hearing they do not hear, because their hearts are hard. And for him who does not know, even that which he has will be taken away. Now, that itself lends itself to many interpretations, but one that I understand it to mean is that if you get the sense of how this process works, then the world is opened up to you. But if you are a lawyer in religion rather than a poet, then you're stopped. Because you don't have the imagination to know how to translate that story into spiritual meaning. It requires of us thought and effort, struggle. And is that bad? If you're trying to train an athlete, do you withhold stress? Or do you induce it? The more stress, the better. In increments, gradually, until the athlete gradually becomes more and more proficient. Same thing is true spiritually. Have you ever noticed how some of the people you most admire spiritually have a horrible, horrible life, and you wonder if God's punishing? No, he's training them.
I always remember Bill Sears when I talked about that, saying, as I'm sure you've all heard talk about the time in his life when he referred to the passage where no one is tested beyond their capacity, and then he looks up and says, "Are you sure you know my capacity?" But I think God knows his capacity. Right now in this room,
things about the people in the automobiles usually. There are symphonies playing, and there are lousy TV shows. Only we don't hear them and we don't see them because we don't have with us, maybe some of you do, but on stage we don't have any equipment to translate those ephemeral waves into tangible, sensible form. Our bodies are, in this life, the metaphors of ourselves, but they are not ourselves. They are the receivers by which our souls communicate to this world. Unfortunately, we are too often judged in this world by the appearance of the receiver rather than the message that is being conveyed. But the importance of this metaphorical relationship is to understand that that's what the whole world is about. That on every level, Baha'i says, everything in creation has something to tell us about the attributes of God. Every relationship has a metaphorical value to it. The writings of the prophets have a metaphorical value. We'll get into that tomorrow. That's what the main thing is, how this works and how you use it. A very practical application of this theory I've been talking about. One of the joys I hope to have in the next year is to write for the Publishing Trust a book in which I approach the subject of how the Baha'i administrative order is a metaphorical exercise. Every aspect of it. And of course, I'm sure you're all aware of that. Of how, what consultation, what you're learning in consultation, what are you acting out there? It's all a drama. Just as the conference at Badash was a metaphorical drama, as I understand it, with Baha'u'llah, the director of that play. And Khodus represented the conservative leanings of the gathered Babis who wanted to retain their identity as Muslims and not throw away the Muslim traditions, but still believe that the Bab was a spiritual messenger. And Tahireh representing that faction which believe that no, this is a new revelation and all of the Islamic dispensation is, or the Islamic laws are abrogated. And a new garden has appeared. 3 gardens they had in the Khodus, Tahireh, and Baha'u'llah. Drama. That's what our lives are about. The administrative order of Baha'u'llah, in other words, is a vast poem. The ultimate poem that this planet can write. Namely, to take the kingdom of God, which is a spiritual existence, and write it in physical form. Not in a final physical form, but an ever-evolving expression. A poem that is always getting better. That's what we are about as Baha'i, is making the world a poetic statement of the kingdom of God, and on a particular level, making our lives poetic statements of our beliefs in Baha'u'llah. Now, before I leave, I've got a homework assignment for you. I want you to look at hidden word, Arabic hidden word 71, Persian hidden word number 33, and Persian hidden word number 72 for tomorrow. Arabic decipher or decode, as the vogue term is, the metaphorical ingredients in those hidden words. Tomorrow I hope to get a little more particularly into how this process, let me put it this way. One of the basic questions, and I'll finish with this because I know my time is up. One of the basic questions a student asks when you confront them with poetry, or one of the great responses is, I don't do that kind of thing. Now, that's a legitimate response in the sense that some people, for reasons we cannot know, are intuitively good at poetry and some aren't. Just as Baha'i says, the ability to understand the writings of the manifestation, the birds of heaven, is in no wise dependent on acquired learning. It's not something you really can be taught in that sense. And yet, if you stop at that point, it means, well, some of us are good at it and some of us aren't. So let's just, go on to something we can handle. There is something you can do when you're stopped by it. There is a way of understanding the mechanics of this process that can unlock for you the way it works and where you go when you come up against an action or an idea or a passage that you simply don't understand. And that's what we will do tomorrow. Well, that's the topic of the poetry of the Baha'i life, how it works, kind of. Tomorrow we'll talk about more specifically how we make our lives a poem. And we'll also discover why the title of today's session was Eye to Eye. Think about that. Very metaphorical. And tomorrow's is, what is it? Revision. It actually does work, you will find. Any questions? Good. Thank you.